Okay, so let's dive right into this. We're going to be talking about a technology that could do more than just tweak what's on our plates. I mean, it could completely rewrite the rulebook for our entire global food system. It's called precision fermentation, and some people are making some seriously bold predictions about it.
I mean, look at this one. That's a huge provocative statement, right? The end of traditional farming. But could it actually be true? To figure that out, we really need to understand what this technology is and what it's promising. So, what exactly are we talking about here?
Well, in short, it's all about making real animal products, but without the animals. I want you to imagine brewing milk protein in a giant tank, pretty much the same way you'd brew beer. We're literally talking about taking the genetic instructions for something like whey protein and then just giving it to a tiny microbe, like yeast, to produce for us. So to really get our heads around that big, world-changing claim, we first have to look at the science behind it. And honestly, it's probably a less complicated than you might think.
Yeah, the best way to understand this whole thing is to start with something we're all familiar with, fermentation. It's an ancient process for sure, but this is a very, very new and incredibly precise twist on it. Now, what's really interesting here is the difference in focus. For thousands of years, we've used fermentation to change a whole ingredient, turning cabbage into kimchi or grapes into wine. Precision fermentation is totally different. It's about programming a microbe to produce just one single pure thing. It's the difference between a whole band jamming out a song and a virtuoso violinist playing a perfect solo. And this breaks it down perfectly. First, you find the genetic recipe for what you want to make. Let's say a milk protein. Second, you give that recipe to a tiny worker, like everyday baker's yeast. Third, you put those workers into a big tank, a bioreactor, and you feed them simple sugars. As they eat, they just follow your instructions and crank out the protein. And finally, you just filter everything else out, leaving you with a pure protein that is molecularly identical to the one that comes from a cow. Simple as that.
So, okay, that's the how, but what can we actually do with this technology? I mean, the ability to brew almost any complex organic molecule just opens up a staggering number of possibilities, way, way beyond just a glass of milk.
And this list is it's incredible. We're talking about real dairy proteins for cheese and ice cream that are identical to the original. The heme molecule that gives plant-based burgers that meaty taste. Egg whites for baking with no chickens involved. Animal-free collagen for cosmetics. Even things like spider silk for super strong futuristic textiles. It's not just about food, it's a whole new platform for making, well, almost anything.
And this is where that whole world-changing idea really starts to click. The environmental contrast is just stark. On one hand, you have animal agriculture, which uses a massive amount of our planet's land and water. On the other, precision fermentation uses a tiny, tiny fraction of those resources. And crucially, it completely eliminates methane from livestock, which is a hugely powerful greenhouse gas. But it goes even further. This technology tackles some major ethical concerns about factory farming. It could dramatically cut down on the huge amounts of antibiotics we pump into livestock, which is a big driver of antibiotic resistance. And because it's all done in a clean, controlled environment, the risk of stuff like E. coli or salmonella goes way down. Plus, you can design the products you want, like real dairy that's naturally lactose-free from the get-go. Okay, so the promise is enormous. We get it. But let's be realistic for a second. The path from a lab to your kitchen table is filled with some pretty massive challenges. And these are really the big 4 questions hanging over the whole industry. First, scaling up. Can we actually build enough of these giant bioreactors to do this at a global scale? Second, cost. Can we make these products as cheap or even cheaper than the ones we have now? Third, consumer trust. Will people be okay with eating food that comes from genetically engineered microbes? And maybe the most important question of all, what does this do to the millions of farmers whose livelihoods depend on the system we have today? These are the real-world hurdles that are going to define the future here.
So let's circle all the way back to that dramatic statement from the beginning. Is this really the end of traditional farming? Well, the reality is probably going to be a lot more complex, and maybe even more interesting than that. Yeah, instead of a total replacement, what we might see is more of an evolution, a future where different food systems actually work together. Maybe traditional farms will grow the sugars and other things needed to feed the bioreactors, or maybe they'll focus more on regenerative agriculture and high-value specialty products. It could be less of a war between old and new tech, and more of a new symbiotic partnership. Which brings us to this final thought. We are really just at the very, very beginning of this revolution. We have unlocked a powerful new way to create things from the molecule up. Milk proteins, egg proteins, meat proteins, that's just the start. The real question now is, what are the limits? And what do we want to create with this incredible new toolkit? The possibilities are, well, they're truly staggering to think about.